The morning Astrid's father died, the sky over their small coastal village hung heavy with iron-grey clouds that pressed down like a warning. She had woken to find him cold in his bed, his weathered hands finally still after months of labored breathing. The sickness had taken him slowly, eating away at his strength until there was nothing left but bone and shallow breath. She sat beside him for hours, unable to move, unable to cry. The silence of the house felt louder than any storm. Her father had been a merchant once, respected, known throughout the fjords for his fair dealings and honest tongue. But illness doesn't care about reputation. The treatments, the healers, the desperate trades to keep him alive another week. Another day. They had bled their wealth dry. By the time she finally stood to prepare his body, the debts had already begun circling like ravens. The first knock came that very afternoon. Astrid opened the door to find Halvard, a trader from the northern settlements, his face carved with false sympathy. Behind him stood two men she didn't recognize, their expressions blank and cold. "My condolences for your loss," Halvard said, though his eyes swept past her into the house, calculating. "Your father was a good man. It pains me to come at such a time, but business cannot wait for grief." Astrid's fingers tightened on the door frame. "What business?" "The debts he owed me. 300 silver marks, to be precise." He produced a worn ledger, thrust it toward her. The numbers swam before her eyes. "I was patient while he lived out of respect. But now I have nothing," she whispered. The truth of it crashed over her like freezing water. The house, the land, even the furniture, all of it mortgaged, promised to creditors she hadn't known existed. Halvard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone has something, girl. Your father understood that. He signed the contract himself. Should he fail to repay, his household would settle the debt through service." The word hung in the air between them. "Sharp as a blade, service," she repeated numbly. 7 years of labor. "It's generous, considering the sum." He gestured to his men. "Gather what you need. You leave within the hour." Astrid wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But where? Her mother had died in childbirth years ago. She had no siblings, no relatives who would claim her. The village that had once known her father's kindness now turned their faces away, afraid that acknowledging her might make them responsible. She packed a single bag with trembling hands. A change of clothes, her mother's wooden comb, a small knife for eating. Everything else would be sold to chip away at the impossible debt. As she stepped out of the house for the last time, the wind cut through her cloak, and she realized she was already shivering. The journey north took 5 days. They traveled in a rough cart pulled by 2 bored horses, Astrid wedged between crates of salted fish and wool bales. Halvard's men barely spoke to her, treating her with the same indifference they showed the cargo. At night, they camped beside the road, and she curled beneath a thin blanket, listening to them laugh and drink around the fire while she lay in the darkness, invisible. When they finally reached Halvard's settlement, a sprawling compound of wooden buildings near the coast, Astrid understood with sinking clarity what her life had become. She was taken to the servants' quarters, a long, low structure that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Inside, 24 others labored under the same crushing weight of debt or misfortune. Most wouldn't meet her eyes. "You'll work in the kitchens," a hard-faced woman named Bergthora told her, shoving a rough apron into her arms. "Up before dawn, sleep when the work is done. You try to run, Halvard's men will find you. They always do." And the punishment, she let the sentence hang, her scarred hands finishing the thought. The work was relentless. Astrid's days blurred into an endless cycle of scrubbing, cooking, hauling water from the well, until her shoulders screamed. Her hands, once soft from her father's protection, cracked and bled. She learned to move quickly, to keep her head down, to swallow the tears that threatened whenever she remembered her father's laugh. The warmth of their small home, the life that felt like a dream now. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter came early that year, brutal and unforgiving. The settlement hunkered down against howling winds that drove snow sideways, piling drifts against the buildings. Astrid's thin clothing offered little protection during her trips to the well or the smokehouse. Her fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. One night, huddled in her corner of the servants' quarters, she overheard two of the older workers whispering. "Halvard's selling again," one said, voice low. "Taking a group to the spring market in Kaupang. Needs coin for new ships. Who's he taking? Anyone he can get a good price for. Young ones mostly. Pretty faces fetch more." Astrid's blood turned to ice. She understood then that her 7 years of service might never come. Halvard could sell her contract to someone else, someone worse. She could be passed from hand to hand like a piece of property, her life measured only in the silver she could bring. The realization sat in her chest like a stone. She had lost everything, her father, her home, her freedom, her future, and she was powerless to change any of it. The morning they loaded the cart for Kaupang, Astrid stood with 9 others, all wearing the same hollow expression. Halvard walked down the line, inspecting them like livestock, occasionally reaching out to tilt a chin up or check teeth. When he got to Astrid, he smiled. "You'll do well at market," he said. "Tragic story, good bones, still young enough to be trained properly. Should clear your father's debt and then some." He laughed. "See, I'm doing you a favor." Astrid said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than words. But inside, beneath the numbness and fear, a small ember of anger began to glow. Not hot enough to warm her, not yet, but enough to remind her that somewhere, beneath everything they'd taken, she was still alive. Kaupang sprawled along the shoreline, like a creature made of wood and ambition, its docks crowded with ships from every corner of the Norse world. The spring market had transformed the settlement into something both magnificent and terrible, a place where anything could be bought or sold, where fortunes changed hands as easily as rumors, where the desperate and the powerful collided in a chaos of commerce. Astrid stood in the trading square with the others, her wrists bound loosely with rope as a formality. Halvard had positioned them near the center, where foot traffic was heaviest, where passing traders and jarls could easily inspect the merchandise. A painted sign above them read, "Quality labor, fair contracts, inquire within." The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the crowds. Astrid kept her eyes down, watching the dirt beneath her feet, trying to disappear into herself. But she couldn't block out the voices, the casual discussions of her worth, the hands that grabbed her chin to examine her face, the questions about her health, her skills, her temperament. "This one's too thin," a wealthy merchant's wife said dismissively, barely glancing at Astrid. "I need someone who can handle heavy work." "She's stronger than she looks," Halvard assured, launching into his practiced sales pitch. "Good bloodlines, father was a respected trader. She's educated, can read and figure accounts. Wasted in the kitchens, really." The woman moved on anyway. Others came and went. Farmers looking for field hands, craftsmen needing apprentices, household masters seeking servants. Each time someone showed interest, Astrid felt herself being reduced further. Her entire existence boiled down to a transaction, a price, a purpose that belonged to someone else. By midday, 2 from their group had been sold. A young man went to a blacksmith in the eastern settlements. A girl no more than 15 was claimed by a trader heading to the Rus territories, and Astrid watched her face crumble as she was led away, probably realizing she'd never see her homeland again. "You're next," Halvard said to Astrid, and something in his voice made her skin crawl. "Got a buyer coming this afternoon. Good offer, too." You should be grateful she wasn't, especially not when the buyer arrived, a thick-necked brute named Jorund, who owned a tavern in one of the rougher coastal towns. He looked Astrid over with eyes that made her want to scrub her skin raw. "She'll do," he grunted. "Needs meat on her bones, but the customers won't mind. Probably prefer her breakable." He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. 300 marks, you said? 350? Halvard counted smoothly. "She's quality, Jorund. Worth the extra coin." They were haggling over the price. The deal nearly struck when the crowd suddenly shifted. A ripple of awareness moved through the square, conversations dropping to murmurs, heads turning toward the northern entrance. Astrid looked up despite herself. They came like a force of nature, 20 warriors moving in tight formation. their presence commanding immediate respect. They wore no flashy decorations, no unnecessary ornaments, just leather, wool, and the kind of weapons that had seen real use. Salt spray and wind damage marked their clothing, and their faces carried the weathered confidence of men who had survived things that would break others. But it was the man at their center who stole every eye in the market. He stood a head taller than most, broad-shouldered and built like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, was pulled back from a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so fierce. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, a pale line that only emphasized the intensity of his gaze. He wore simple clothing, but the silver arm ring on his bicep and the quality of the sword at his hip marked him as nobility. "That's Prince Eric," someone whispered nearby. "Jarl Thorsten's son, the one who raided the Saxon coasts last summer," another voice added. "I heard he took 3 ships down single-handedly. Fearless, some say touched by Odin himself." The prince moved through the market with purpose, his warriors fanning out to examine goods and conduct business. He stopped occasionally to inspect weapons, to speak with craftsmen, to handle bolts of cloth with surprising care. There was an economy to his movements. Nothing wasted, every action deliberate, and then, as if drawn by something invisible, his path led him directly past the trading square where Astrid stood. She didn't mean to look up. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her head down, to remain invisible. But something pulled her gaze upward, and suddenly she was staring directly into eyes, the color of winter ice, pale, sharp, seeing everything. The prince stopped walking. Time seemed to slow. The market noise faded to a distant hum. Astrid couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. In those eyes she saw something unexpected. Not cruelty or indifference, but a fierce, calculating intelligence that seemed to strip away every defense she'd built and see straight down to the raw, wounded core of her. "You," Prince Eric said, his voice deep and commanding. "What's your story?" Halvard practically tripped over himself, hurrying forward. "My lord, this is Astrid, daughter of—" "I wasn't asking you." The prince didn't even glance at Halvard. His attention remained locked on Astrid. "I'm asking her." Astrid's mouth went dry. She tried to find words, but they tangled on her tongue. What could she possibly say? What did he want to hear? My father died," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "His debts became mine, and now you're being sold to pay them." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Prince Eirik's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His gaze shifted to Jorund, who had gone very still, then to Halvard. "How much?" "She's already promised to—" Halvard began. "I didn't ask about promises. I asked about price." The tone left no room for argument. Halvard swallowed hard. 350 silver marks, my lord." "Done." Prince Eirik didn't hesitate. He gestured to one of his men, who immediately stepped forward with a leather purse that clinked heavily. "Count it." Then cut her loose. The square erupted in whispers. Jorund's face went purple with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to challenge a prince. Halvard counted the silver with shaking fingers, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and greed. Astrid stood frozen as someone cut the rope from her wrists. She stared at Prince Eirik, trying to understand what had just happened. Why would anyone pay such a sum for her? What did he want? What would he demand in return? As if reading her thoughts, the prince leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to hers. "You're free," he said quietly. The words meant only for her. "No debts, no service, free. Do you understand?" She didn't. None of this made sense. Freedom wasn't real, wasn't something that actually existed for people like her. It was a word, a dream, a lie told to make the chains feel lighter. "I don't understand," she whispered. Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "You will." He straightened, raising his voice. "She's under my protection now. Anyone who touches her answers to me." The declaration sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Protection from a prince was no small thing. It was a shield that extended far beyond Kupang, a promise enforced by steel and blood. Prince Eirik turned to his men. "Find her proper clothing and food. She travels with us." "My lord," one of them ventured carefully, "the ships are ready to depart. Then we depart when she's ready." The prince's tone made it clear the matter was settled. As his warriors moved to obey, Astrid finally found her voice. "Why?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "Why did you buy me if not for—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Prince Eric regarded her with those unsettling ice-blue eyes. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because watching that pig Jorund walk away with you would have been an insult to honor. And because—" He paused, and for just a moment something vulnerable flickered behind his fierce exterior. "Because everyone deserves at least one person willing to stand between them and the darkness." Then he walked away, barking orders to his men, leaving Astrid standing in the trading square, with tears streaming down her face, the first tears she'd allowed herself since her father died. She was free. She didn't know what it meant yet, didn't know what came next, didn't know if she could trust the fierce prince who had shattered her chains with nothing but words and silver. But for the first time in months, the stone in her chest felt just a little bit lighter. The ship cut through the fjord waters like a blade, its sail billowing with the strong southern wind. Astrid sat near the stern, wrapped in the warm woolen cloak one of Prince Eirik's men had given her, watching the Norwegian coastline slide past in a blur of pine-covered slopes and granite cliffs. The spray from the waves occasionally misted her face, cold and sharp, a reminder that she was truly here, truly moving, truly free. It had been 3 days since Kopang. 3 days of slowly beginning to believe that this wasn't some cruel dream from which she'd wake to find herself back in Halvard's kitchens. The prince's crew treated her with a careful respect that felt almost foreign. They made sure she had the best spot on the ship, out of the worst of the wind. They shared their food without resentment. Dried fish, hard bread, cheese, even some preserved apples that tasted like luxury after months of kitchen scraps. They didn't leer or make crude jokes. They simply accepted her presence because their prince had declared it so. Prince Eirik himself remained an enigma. He spent most of the journey at the ship's prow with his helmsman, discussing routes and weather patterns, or sitting with his warriors discussing matters Astrid couldn't hear. But she felt his awareness of her constantly, the occasional glance to ensure she was comfortable, the subtle adjustment of their rest stops to accommodate her unused legs, the quiet command that kept his men respectful. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, he finally approached her. "You should eat more," he said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside her. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into his features, the weight he carried that had nothing to do with physical strength. "You're still too thin. The journey to my father's hall is another 4 days. Astrid accepted the dried meat he offered. "I'm not used to being given a choice about when I eat. You have choices now. You'll need to remember how to make them." The comment struck deeper than he probably intended. Astrid turned the meat over in her hands, gathering courage. "My lord!" "Eric, just Eric when it's us talking. That's not proper. Neither is buying someone's freedom and then insisting on formality." He leaned back against the ship's side, watching the darkening sky. "Ask your question, Astrid. I can see it weighing on you." She took a breath. "What happens when we reach your father's hall? What do you expect from me?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "Nothing," he repeated firmly. "You're not my thrall, not my servant. You're a free woman under my protection. My father's hall is large enough that you'll have your own space. Food, clothing, safety, all provided. Beyond that, what you do with your life is your choice." It sounded too good to be true. Astrid had learned the hard way that nothing came without cost. "There must be something you want in return." Eric was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard before. "I had a sister once, Freya. She was younger than you, bright as summer, kind to everyone." His jaw tightened. "When I was away on my first raid, my father's enemies came. They couldn't touch him directly, so they took her instead. Sold her to raiders heading east. By the time I got home, by the time I tracked her down—" He stopped, pain flickering across his face. I was too late. Astrid's throat tightened. I'm sorry. I swore that day I would never look away again. Never let someone suffer when I had the power to stop it. He turned to face her, and she saw the truth burning in those ice-blue eyes. I don't want anything from you, Astrid. I want something for you. A chance to rebuild. To remember who you were before everything was taken. That's all. The sincerity in his words broke something loose inside her. I don't know if I can remember, she whispered. I don't know if that person still exists. She does. Eric's voice softened. She's sitting here asking questions, refusing to accept things at face value. That takes courage. That takes a self that survived. They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging one by one overhead. Around them, the crew settled into their evening routine, some taking their turn at the oars, others breaking out dice for games, a few singing old sailing songs in low voices. Tell me about your father, Eric said eventually. What was he like? And somehow, with the night as a shield and the rhythm of the waves as comfort, Astrid found herself talking. She told him about her father's merchant days, about how he would bring her small treasures from his travels, a piece of amber, a silver bead, once a book of Latin prayers that she'd learned to read, even though she didn't understand the language. She told him about his kindness, how he'd never turned away anyone who asked for help, how that very generosity had left them vulnerable when illness struck. He sounds like a good man, Eric said when she finished. He was. Too good, maybe. The world punishes that. The world is harsh. But that doesn't mean we should become harsh to survive it. Over the following days, more conversations came. Eric would find reasons to check on her, bringing her warmer clothing when the wind picked up, pointing out landmarks along the coast, sharing stories of his travels. He never pushed, never demanded her attention, but he was there. A constant, steady presence. His men noticed, of course. Astrid caught the meaningful glances they exchanged, the small smiles when their prince made excuses to speak with her. But they kept their observations to themselves. Too loyal and too smart to comment. On the 6th day, they rounded a massive headland, and suddenly the landscape opened up to reveal a broad valley where a river met the sea. Nestled against the slopes stood Jarl Thorsten's hall, not the modest longhouse Astrid had expected, but a sprawling complex of buildings that spoke of real power and wealth. The main hall rose 3 stories, its carved beams decorated with intricate knotwork, its roof adorned with dragon heads that seemed to watch their approach. Home, Eric said, and Astrid heard both pride and something heavier in his voice. Brace yourself. My father's intense. The ships pulled into the dock amid shouts of greeting. People emerged from the various buildings, warriors, servants, craftsmen, all eager to welcome their prince home. Eric disembarked first, clasping arms with the men who greeted him, accepting embraces from the women. Then he turned and offered his hand to Astrid. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, letting him help her onto the dock. The casual intimacy of the gesture wasn't lost on the assembled crowd. Whispers rippled through them like wind through grass. Let them talk, Eric said quietly, still holding her hand. You're under my protection. That means something here. They walked toward the main hall, the crowd parting before them. Astrid's heart hammered. She'd gone from slave to... what exactly? Guest ward. The uncertainty was almost as frightening as the certainty of chains had been. The hall's great doors swung open, and a man emerged who could only be Jarl Thorsten. He shared his son's build and bearing, though age had silvered his hair and carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, the same pale ice blue as Eric's, swept over his son, then fixed on Astrid with sharp assessment. You return with victories and silver, Jarl Thorsten said, his voice carrying across the yard. And a woman who looks half-starved. Should I ask? You should meet her, Eric replied calmly. Father, this is Astrid Bjornsdottir. She'll be staying with us as my guest. Astrid, my father, Jarl Thorsten Eriksson. Astrid bowed, her mind racing through proper protocols she'd learned long ago. My lord, your hospitality honors me. Thorsten's expression remained unreadable. We'll speak in private, Eric. Now. He turned and disappeared back into the hall. Eric squeezed her hand once, reassuringly, then released it. Wait here. This won't take long, but as Astrid watched him stride into the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything, her freedom, her safety, her fragile new beginning, hung in the balance of whatever conversation was about to happen behind those massive doors. She was free, yes, but freedom, she was learning, came with its own complicated weight. The argument in Jarl Thorsten's private chamber could probably be heard throughout half the hall, though Astrid tried not to listen from where she waited in the main room. She sat on a bench near the great hearth, accepting the cup of warm mead a kind-faced servant woman had pressed into her hands, trying not to think about what would happen if the Jarl decided she couldn't stay. When Eric finally emerged, his jaw was set in a way that suggested the conversation hadn't been easy. But his eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression relaxed. "You're staying," he said simply. "My father agrees you're under our household's protection. Ragnar will show you to your room." The servant woman from before stepped forward with a warm smile. "Come, child. You look ready to drop. A hot bath and proper food will do you good." The room they gave her was small but comfortable. A space of her own, with a real bed, thick furs, a chest for belongings she didn't yet have. Windows looked out over the valley, and Astrid stood there for a long time, watching the sun set behind the mountains, trying to absorb the reality of her situation. That night, she ate at the Jarl's table, not as a servant, but as a guest seated near Eric. The food was overwhelming after months of scraps: roasted venison, fresh bread with butter, vegetables in cream sauce, preserved berries. She ate slowly, trying not to seem desperate. Aware of the curious glances from the household, Jarl Thorsten watched her throughout the meal with those assessing eyes. Finally he spoke. "My son tells me you can read and figure accounts." Astrid swallowed carefully. "Yes, my lord. My father taught me." "Good, we can use that. Too many of these warriors can barely scratch their own names." He gestured broadly at the men around them, earning good-natured protests. "You'll work with Asmund, my steward. Keep the household records, help with trade tallies. Earn your keep properly." It wasn't a request, but Astrid didn't mind. Work she understood. Work with purpose felt like dignity. "Thank you, my lord." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surreal in its normality. Mornings, Astrid worked with Asmund, learning the complex web of the household's accounts. The old steward was patient and thorough, clearly pleased to have someone who could calculate quickly and write clearly. Afternoons, she helped Ragnar with various tasks, not as a servant, but as someone contributing to the household. Slowly, she began to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than property. Her hands healed. The constant fear faded. She slept without nightmares. The hollow look left her eyes, and weight returned to her frame. The spring deepened into early summer, and the valley exploded with green life. And through it all, Eric was there, not hovering, not demanding, but present. He would find her after training sessions with his men, still breathing hard, to ask how her day had been. He brought her books from his father's collection when he noticed her reading. He invited her to walk with him along the river in the evenings, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. "You seem different," he observed one evening, as they sat on a fallen log overlooking the water. The midnight sun cast everything in golden light. "More yourself." "I'm remembering," Astrid said softly. "Remembering what it feels like to make choices, to have thoughts that matter, to be more than—" She trailed off. "More than what they tried to make you." Eric's voice was gentle. "You were always more, Astrid. They just tried to convince you otherwise." She turned to look at him, this fierce prince who had saved her for no reason except that he could, who asked nothing in return, who had given her the space to heal. "Why are you so kind to me? Is kindness so rare it requires explanation?" "In my experience." Yes, Eric was quiet for a moment, watching the play of light on the water. "When I found my sister," he finally said, "she was broken in ways I couldn't fix. The things they'd done to her, the person they'd tried to turn her into, she couldn't find her way back. She took her own life 3 weeks after I brought her home." His voice cracked slightly. "I swore I'd never let that happen again if I had the power to prevent it." So when I saw you in that market, saw that same brokenness trying to take root, he met her eyes. I couldn't walk away. And I won't walk away now, not until you're strong enough that you don't need anyone standing between you and the darkness. Astrid felt tears prick her eyes. I think I'm getting there. I know you are. I see it every day. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that ran deeper than words. Astrid reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, as if she'd given him something precious. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Eric squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for surviving long enough for me to find you. As summer progressed, Astrid became a true part of the household. She earned respect through her work, proving herself invaluable to Astmund and the smooth running of the Jarl's affairs. She made friends among the household women, joining their conversations and laughter. She even began training with a small knife under the instruction of one of Eric's warriors, not because she expected to need it, but because never being helpless again felt important. Jarl Thorsten, initially suspicious, gradually warmed to her. He would seek her out to discuss trade matters, valuing her educated perspective. Once, after she'd identified an error in a merchant's tally that would have cost them significantly, he'd actually smiled. My son chose well, he'd said gruffly. And Astrid understood it was the highest compliment he could offer. But it was her relationship with Eirik that truly blossomed. They were drawn to each other like moon and tide, inevitable, natural, right. Their evening walks became daily rituals. They would talk about everything. His dreams of expanding trade routes, her memories of her father's stories, their shared love of the sea, their fears and hopes, and the small observations that made up a life. One evening, as they stood on a cliff overlooking the fjord, Eric turned to her with unusual hesitancy. Astrid, I need to tell you something. Her heart skipped. What is it? When I bought your freedom, I told myself it was just about giving you a chance, about honoring my sister's memory. And that was true, but... He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she'd learned meant he was struggling with words. It stopped being just that somewhere along the way. Maybe it was never just that. I don't know when it happened, but you've become... He stopped, took a breath, then met her eyes with that fierce honesty she'd come to treasure. You matter to me, not as someone I saved, but as someone I choose. Every day I choose you, and I need you to know that. To understand that whatever is growing between us is real, and... Astrid stepped forward and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, a question as much as an answer. Eric froze for a heartbeat, then pulled her closer, one hand cradling her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. The kiss deepened, and Astrid felt something fundamental settle into place. This was right. This was real. This was hers. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eric rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I think I've loved you since you looked up at me in that market and refused to pretend everything was fine. I love you too, Astrid whispered. You gave me back my life. You gave me back myself. No. Eric pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. You did that. I just made sure you had the space to do it. Your strength, your healing, your choice to trust again, that's all you, Astrid. They stood wrapped in each other as the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors. Astrid thought about the journey that had brought her here. The loss, the pain, the fear, the darkness. She thought about her father and hoped he would approve of the man she'd chosen. She thought about Eric's sister and silently promised her that the chance she'd been denied wouldn't be wasted. What happens now? She asked eventually. Now? Eric smiled, and it transformed his usually fierce face into something boyish and bright. Now we build something together, a life, a future, whatever we want it to be. You're not bound by anything except your own choices anymore. Then I choose this, Astrid said firmly. I choose you, this place, this life we can make together. Are you sure? Being with a prince comes with complications. Politics, expectations, dangers I can't always protect you from. I'm sure. And she was. For the first time since her father's death, she was absolutely certain of something. I didn't survive everything I survived just to play it safe now. I want the complicated, messy, real thing. With you. Eric kissed her again, and this time it tasted like promise, like future, like home. The summer stretched ahead of them, full of possibility. Astrid would continue her work with the household, would continue strengthening her place in this community. Eric would prepare for the autumn trading season, would continue earning his reputation as a fair and honorable leader. And together they would navigate whatever came next. She had been sold after her father's death, reduced to nothing but a debt to be paid. But the Viking prince had bought not just her freedom, but given her the space to reclaim herself. And now, standing on this cliff with his arms around her and the vast Norwegian sky overhead, Astrid understood that freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. Freedom was choosing who you loved. Freedom was deciding what you built with your own hands. Freedom was the fierce, terrifying, beautiful act of opening yourself to possibility again after everything had tried to break you. She had lost everything once. But here, in the shelter of these mountains and the strength of this man's love, she was building something new, something that belonged to her, something that no one could ever take away. The wind picked up, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the green scent of summer. Eric tucked her closer against his side, and together they watched the sun paint the world in gold and amber, standing at the edge of the fjord like they stood at the edge of their future. Vast, unknown and full of promise, ready to go back. Eric asked eventually. Astrid smiled, thinking of the warm hall waiting for them, of Ragnar's knowing looks and the Jarl's gruff acceptance, of her small room that had become a sanctuary of all the ordinary. Precious details of the life she was building. Yes, she said. Let's go home. And hand in hand, they walked down the cliff path as the stars